I pulled into my driveway after work and immediately knew something was wrong. My garage door had something on it. From the street, it looked like a shadow. But as I got closer, I realized what I was actually looking at. Spray paint, bright red, 6 feet across the entire garage face, in letters big enough to read from 3 houses down. Mind your own business. I sat in my car for a full minute, just staring at it. The paint had dripped in a few places, long red streaks running down toward the concrete, which meant it had happened hours ago, probably overnight. What I didn't know yet was that my doorbell camera had already captured the person who did it. And what I really didn't know, what would make everything that followed infinitely more complicated, I wouldn't even describe as complicated. It was worse than that. The whole thing started about 3 weeks earlier. I'd submitted a request to replace the fence along my property line. Standard stuff. The HOA guidelines were clear. 6 feet, cedar, natural stain. I measured. I checked the handbook twice. I even went to the architecture review meeting with color samples, which is about as fun as it sounds. The request was approved. 3 days later, the HOA president, a man named Rick Carlson, showed up at my front door. He had one of those clipboards, the metal kind, the kind people carry when they want you to know they're in charge of something. He told me the fence wasn't approved after all. I asked him why. He gave me a few vague answers about sight lines and community aesthetics. None of them made sense until my neighbor filled in the missing piece. The fence was going to block the view from Rick Carlson's kitchen window. He liked looking at my yard while he ate breakfast. And apparently losing that view was a bigger problem than me following every rule in the handbook. I built the fence anyway. The HOA sent a violation notice. Dismissed. They sent a second one. Also dismissed. Then a third. At that point, I started to wonder whether Rick Carlson had anything better to do. That's when things became even more interesting. Rick's son, a 17-year-old named Tyler, started appearing across the street. At first, I didn't think anything of it. He was a teenager. Teenagers stand around. That's basically a hobby. But then I noticed it wasn't random. He was always there when I came home, standing on the corner with his phone, not texting, just watching. Sometimes he'd ride his bike past my house, slow, making sure I saw him. My wife told me I was being paranoid. I told her I'd rather be paranoid and right than relaxed and surprised. Then things escalated again. One evening, I found my trash cans knocked over into the street. All 3 of them, spread across the asphalt like someone had taken a running start. The next week, my mailbox was dented. Not destroyed, just dented, like someone hit it once with a bat. Just hard enough to leave a mark. Nothing big enough to call the police over. Just enough to let me know someone was sending a message. The morning after the spray paint appeared, I pulled up the doorbell camera footage. It was 2:47 a.m. Tyler Carlson walked up my driveway with a can of spray paint in one hand and his phone in the other, recording himself. The footage lasted nearly 4 minutes. 4 minutes. 4 minutes of him tagging my garage door while his friend stood on the sidewalk laughing. He shook the can before every pass. This deliberate little motion, like he'd done this before and wanted to make sure the paint came out thick. He stepped back twice to check his work, like an artist evaluating a canvas. Then he posed for a photo in front of it. The flash went off twice. That's the part I still can't get over. Not the vandalism itself, the photo. He wanted a souvenir. What they didn't know was that my doorbell camera had a wide-angle lens. I had his face walking up the driveway. I had the can in his hand. I had the photo flash. I had his friend's face on the sidewalk. I had the make and model of the car they drove away in. I had everything. That's when I picked up my phone and called the police. An officer arrived about 20 minutes later. He watched the footage on my laptop. I could tell by his expression that he'd seen a lot of vandalism cases, but not many where the vandal took selfies with his own crime scene. He took my statement. He asked if I wanted to press charges. I said yes. About 3 hours later, Rick Carlson was at my front door. He had the same clipboard. Of course he did. And he was holding it like it was going to protect him from something. He told me Tyler had made a mistake. He was a good kid. Good grades, looking at colleges in the fall. A criminal record would ruin his future. He said teenagers do stupid things. He said this was something we should handle between neighbors. Then he said the words I'll never forget. I think we can handle this internally, neighbor to neighbor. That's when something shifted, because this wasn't about a fence anymore. This wasn't about spray paint or a dented mailbox or some kid making a bad decision at 2 in the morning. This was about whether one family got to live by different rules than everyone else. I told him no. All that confidence with the clipboard, gone in about 3 seconds. He didn't yell. That's what surprised me. He got quiet. He told me I was making a mistake. He told me he'd been on the board for 11 years. He told me I didn't understand how things worked in this neighborhood. What he meant was that in 11 years, nobody had ever told him no. So I told him something he wasn't expecting. I told him the footage showed Tyler recording the vandalism on his own phone. His son, the good kid applying to colleges, had created a second copy of the evidence, one that didn't belong to me. If anything happened to my footage, or my property, or my family, there was still a record out there that I couldn't control. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away without another word. I closed the door, and then I did something I hadn't done in 3 weeks. I sat down and just breathed, because I knew what was coming next, and I also knew I was right. A week later, at the monthly HOA meeting, Rick Carlson sat at the head of the table like nothing had happened. He went through the minutes. He discussed landscaping guidelines, something about mulch depth. He talked about trash bin placement, as if we hadn't all noticed what happened to mine. He did not mention his son once, so I did. I stood up during the open forum. I asked to use the projector. The room went quiet when the footage appeared on the screen. Tyler Carlson walking up my driveway at 2:47 in the morning, shaking the can, spray painting my garage, posing for selfies. The entire thing, all 4 minutes, playing in front of about 40 homeowners. You could hear people gasping. Several homeowners actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd. Others looked furious. A woman in the second row kept shaking her head, and every time the footage showed something new, the can shaking, the photo pose, she'd shake it harder. And Rick Carlson? He just sat there. His face had gone gray. The clipboard was on the table in front of him, and for the first time since I'd met him, he wasn't holding it. When the footage finished, I turned to face the board. I have one question, I said. Does the HOA have a policy for when its president tries to cover up a crime committed by his own son? The silence that followed was louder than anything said in that room all night. If you're watching this and wondering whether your HOA would do the same thing, here's what I learned. Document everything. Install cameras. A decent doorbell camera costs less than $100, and it's the reason this story has an ending. Save every letter. Save every email. If someone shows up at your door with promises or threats, write down what they said the moment they leave. And if anyone in power, an HOA president, a board member, a neighbor who thinks the rules don't apply to them, ever tells you to handle something quietly, understand what they're actually asking. They're asking you to protect them from the consequences of their own actions at your expense. Don't. Tyler Carlson was charged with misdemeanor vandalism. His college applications will have to explain a criminal record. That's not a detail I enjoy. He's 17. But the alternative was teaching him that there are no consequences when your father runs the HOA. That's a worse lesson in the long run. His father resigned from the board 2 weeks later, officially for personal reasons. Unofficially, because 3 homeowners had already filed the paperwork to remove him, and he knew the vote wouldn't go his way. The management company issued a formal statement. The board revised its conflict of interest policy, something they should have done a decade ago. Several neighbors reached out afterward to tell me they'd had their own run-ins with Rick Carlson over the years, but none of them had felt like they could push back. And my garage door, I painted it, took an afternoon, but every time I pull into my driveway now, I don't see red spray paint. I see what happens when someone assumes you'll stay quiet, and you don't. Hit subscribe. I post new HOA justice stories often. Here's the thing. HOAs exist to protect property values. That's the entire reason they were created. But the people who run them are just people. And people, when nobody holds them accountable, will eventually start protecting themselves instead of the neighborhood. When someone in power tells you to handle something quietly, they're not looking out for the community. They're looking out for themselves because spray paint can be covered. A garage door can be repainted in a weekend. But the moment you let someone convince you that their reputation matters more than what happened to you, that moment, that's when you lose something that doesn't wash off with a fresh coat of paint. What would you have done if the HOA president showed up at your door asking you to drop charges against his son? Drop it in the comments.